Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. In this first hour, we're going to be talking about some of the issues in the news. Next hour, we'll still get into some of that, especially as we get more into the impeachment vote that will be taking place today. Then Michael Horton is going to be with us. He has written in the past about some of these theological trends that concerned him, and some of those surfaced at the Jericho March. Now, we have already had Rod Dreyer on talking about some of those questions, but he was looking at it more in terms of vote for Trump, not vote for Trump, voter irregularities, voter fraud, all of which were certainly relevant issues to talk about. But Michael Horton, being more of a theologian, a professor of systematic theology and apologetics at Westminster Seminary in California, has identified some real kind of disturbing theological trends that surface there and in other places. And the argument I'm going to make with him, now he may want to take some shots, and he's free to do so. That's why we call the program Point of View. I will certainly let him have his point of view, is that even if Donald Trump fades off the scene, and I'm not sure that he will, but if he does, these trends continue. These theological errors and concerns still continue. And so that's really what I want to focus some of my time and attention on with him. Then we'll come back in the next hour, which would be the 2 o'clock hour, and get into some other issues in the news that we haven't covered. Probably a lot of that will have to do with the censorship from big tech. And then before it's all through, Chuck Bentley is going to be with us, giving us sort of financial advice for 2021. He's got a new book out, which we'll just mention, but he also has said, you know, how do we prepare for maybe another pandemic or something? Did we learn some lessons about what to be prepared for? This time last year, we were just talking about this coronavirus and how significant it may or may not have been. And, of course, we've now lived through that through this last year. So I think that would be the case. So just before we get into this, this is a good example of, I thought I had a plan for how we were going to cover this, because I like to have things kind of logically coming together. Maybe that's the obsessive part of me. And so I wanted to have kind of each article flow into another. And so I was going to spend some time, first of all, talking about what has happened in the Texas legislature, and I will, but I thought I'd start by talking about the fact that there's a real question as to whether or not people can even go to the Texas legislature unless they have actually had coronavirus testing before they've entered. And so that, in some respects, leads me to what I was going to cover later in terms of all the things we're learning about the vaccine. So I'll maybe talk about that and then come back to Texas and some of the issues of the legislature. And I might just say that most of you that are listening live in the state of Texas, but not all. And even if you are not interested in the state of Texas or you live in another state, some of this is going to be relevant even in your own state. But it was interesting to see that the Department of Public Safety here in Texas says that it's now going to require all visitors to the Texas Capitol to submit to coronavirus testing before entering. Now, it's one thing to take your temperature. It is quite another to stick something down your nose and make sure that you have actually been tested. So this is becoming kind of a real issue, because if you think about it, the Constitution in the United States, and even, if you will, the Constitution of Texas, talk about the fact that you have a right to petition the government for redress of grievances Well, what about this? You can't even go to the Capitol unless you do so. And so that's kind of one of the issues. So some people have said, well, maybe it's possible then that we'll just do a virtual type of Texas legislature. Well, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, knocked that one down pretty quickly because he and the Attorney General's Office of the state of Texas issued an opinion stating the legislature has no authority to close down the Capitol, regardless of the pandemic, and at the same time also indicated that lawmakers may not vote remotely, as some are starting to propose. Okay, well, we'll see where this goes, but I use that, if nothing else, before we get into all the things in the state of Texas, to actually talk about this vaccine. And we had an announcement that came down yesterday from the Trump administration that it was going to release these vaccine doses that have been held back for the second inoculation to now go out to the states so that they can get more people get the first inoculation. I think that makes some sense. And so there is a good example of where the bureaucracy, in trying to be a little bit careful, also was prohibiting the rollout of the vaccines. And so the Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, by the way, he has not resigned, although so many people on the Trump cabinet have, said every vaccine dose that is sitting in the warehouse rather than going into an arm could mean one more life lost, one more hospital bed occupied. You think? So that's exactly what that is. And the big question that a lot of people are asking is, why can't we give it to the oldest first, the most vulnerable first? Doesn't that make sense? Oh, sure. Common sense is working in some places in the country, but not in the state of New York, because instead what you have there is the governor, which is actually now put together this very complex formula for ranking healthcare employees based upon risk factors, age, occupation, hospital. But then it starts adding in all sorts of other questions about vulnerability because of race, ethnicity, and there you go. And so as a result, there's been somewhat of a pushback to Governor Cuomo now, in which he's now expanded the eligibility of seniors over the age of 75, as well as public safety officers, teachers, and other school. On Tuesday, he even added those over the age of 65 and up to that. And if you are wondering why that is the case, there is very good evidence to indeed show that the older you are, the more likely you are to actually suffer from the coronavirus. No real surprise there, but nevertheless, that is the case. And so that's one of the reasons why they're doing what they can to maybe go back to, let's, if we can, inoculate the oldest first. Well, I'm talking about a second dose. I thought I'd mention this. I heard this the other day. Now I can document it. Got this from Illinois. I've got one from San Diego and other others. A lot of people that have been getting the second dose of the coronavirus vaccine are experiencing what's called a more intense reaction. There seems to be, and I'm using a quote here from the Illinois Department of Public Health, there seems to be a more robust immune response that is manifested in that second dose. And so as a result, they've added that people should not be alarmed that, maybe the first shot, no problem. Second shot, there's some people down for like 4 days. Most people just have a really difficult first day. And I don't claim to be a doctor, but I come from a medical background. I've talked to some people with medical background, and they're thinking maybe the theory here is when you get the first dose, if you've already you've been asymptomatic, you have the virus in you, it's possible that kind of reach you at 100%. And then a few weeks later, when you get the second dose, you get what's called viral loading, and it kind of knocks you for a loop. So anyway, there are now starting to be statements being made that just because you have seen some people when they get the second inoculation really get knocked down for a little bit of time, doesn't mean you shouldn't take it. Nothing else probably illustrates that it's working very well and that you've reached 100% in terms of your viral load and your antibiotic response. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Brian Walsh writes about the future for Axios. Before that, he was a correspondent with Time magazine. He isn't necessarily looking at issues from a Christian perspective, even though his most recent book has the title End Times. He recently wrote about the death spiral of public life. While he acknowledges that technology has kept many people working, fed, and entertained at home, it has forced a retreat from public life that will have what he predicts will be toxic ramifications. As I have documented in previous commentaries, the slight benefit of the lockdowns is overshadowed by the tremendous cost in terms of social, economic, and educational devastation. As a Christian, I would also add that keeping believers from meeting together in church will also have negative consequences. The impact on cities could be significant. One recent report that he cites found that 3 to 4 times more people will end up working remotely than before the pandemic. This would have a profound impact on urban economies, transportation, and consumer spending. Consider that nearly 14% of the office space in Midtown Manhattan is vacant. Both public schools and public transportation seem headed for a death spiral. Frustrated parents withdraw their kids from school, thus affecting funding, which is based on a per-student basis. Public transportation has been crippled with declining ridership as more and more people decide to work remotely. And funding is declining because of plunging state and local government revenue. As technology improves, so will the benefits of staying home. You can work when you want, watch what you want, and eat what you want without leaving your home. All of this will certainly decrease our sense of community. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, I want to talk about some things that are going to happen at the Texas legislature. And if you're a Texan, you want to pay attention to this. If you're not a Texan and from another state, you may want to see if some of these same particular issues will surface in your state legislature. But just before we do so, since I was talking about the vaccine and talking about the pandemic and all the rest, my commentary today really parallels a very good piece by Brian Walsh. Now, Brian Walsh is looking at this more from a secular point of view, although I wanted to alert people to the fact that his most recent book is called End Times, but he's not talking about end times from a Christian point of view or the millennium or tribulation or anything like that. He's just talking about end times because he's kind of a trend watcher. And I have been very intrigued by some of the things he's been writing about. But anyway, he used to be a correspondent with the Time. This particular article that I cite so that you can read it in its entirety is from Axios. But he does, I think, remind us that we have been through not only a tumultuous year, but he argues for the possibility that we could end up with something like the death spiral of public life. I think we all kind of think, well, it's going to be back at business as usual. And he reminds us, and of course, we on this program have tried to remind you that the new normal, or even going back to normal, is going to be different. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have 3 to 4 times more people that will be working from home than ever before. Is that bad? Not at all. I mean, the technology has allowed that to take place, but that does have some consequences. For example, it does suggest the possible death spiral of public transportation. For those of you that are listening that may be in Dallas, you maybe don't depend a whole lot on public transportation. Maybe you have DART or something like that you occasionally use, but not a whole lot. If you live in Chicago, you live in New York, you live really just about any major urban area, public transportation is key, and that has affected you dramatically. Let's just take New York because, again, I believe Brian Walsh lives in New York, and he talks about the fact that nearly 14% of the office space in Midtown Manhattan, that's prime office space, is vacant. That is reminiscent of what happened in 2008 and 2009. He then also talks about the possible death spiral of public schools. Just think about this. If indeed you are paying for students to be educated and they're not in school because they're at, on a computer, or parents have enough of that and say, I'm taking my kid off a computer, I'm going to put them in the private school, then you already see more and more of these kids leaving, and you kind of see this downward spiral that he talks about there as well. And so you can begin to document all sorts of different ways in which public life has been changed. And of course, if you add that to the psychological issues, we just the other day talked with Ryan Casey Waller about anxiety, depression. We've talked with quite a number about that particular issue. You can see that as you look ahead, it may look very different than what it is right now. Wonders for those of us in the ministry, how many people going back to church? You would think by now a lot of people would say, well, I'm going to go to the church service, and yet I believe, of course, we had the threat of snow and rain and cold and everything on last Sunday, but I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that we had more people watching on Zoom than were in the chapel when I was speaking. So, again, that's just one illustration of many others that are changing this. And, of course, more and more people depending upon online services. That's been a boon for Amazon that makes $31 million a day, in profits and things like that. But it does suggest we're moving into a different kind of world. So that's my commentary for you today, if you'd like to read it, or even go back to the original article and some of the other issues. Let's, if we can, though, focus some time and attention on the state of Texas. And that is, I want to look at maybe 6 topics. These come from our friends at the Texan, the Daily Texan there, that has been evaluating some of that. And, of course, the first issue, which I wrote about just the other day, and you will have a commentary coming out shortly, is the issue of redistricting. Because we now have a situation in which, first of all, people move within a state, and so you need to redistrict the various congressional districts and the senatorial districts and, state senatorial, state representative districts and the school board districts and all the rest. And then people also move from other states, and in the state of Texas, you have 3 additional congressional districts that will be added. So we'll go from 36 to 39. Florida gets 2 additional ones. New York loses 1 or 2, depending on which census you use. 1 if you look at April, 2 if you look at July. California is going to lose a variety of others. So redistricting is going to be very important. And so you're going to have the legislators draw the congressional districts, the state House and state Senate districts, and all of the rest. And then after that is all done, as we pointed out, then it has to conform to the Voting Rights Act, which I think is illegitimate. This might have been a problem, say, decades ago, but it isn't now. But again, these rules and statutes and all of that, plus all the lawsuits and all that, are going to be a very significant part of what some legislators are going to be doing in some of these committees. Back to the point I made a minute ago, because we've had these lockdowns, this whole pandemic has caused people to want to reevaluate the emergency power structure in the state of Texas, which they feel is out of date. And so a number of people have put forward bills even some constitutional amendments to begin to redefine what those powers are and maybe take some of the power away from a governor, a county judge, or maybe even a mayor. So those are going to be very important issues. We just had an election, as you imagine. Number 3, mail-in balloting is going to be a big issue because you already have Democrats which have come up with 6 kind of versions of the same bill to actually expand absentee voting so that you could even have total mail-in balloting. As you might imagine, Republicans also have filed bills to specifically prohibit any official from providing a mail-in ballot application to a voter that didn't request it. That goes back to what happened in Harris County. So I think you're starting to see we're going to have a lot of issues here in the Texas legislature. 3 more real quickly, and then we'll take a break. The first is the issue of property tax. That comes up, of course, every time the legislature meets. After the last session, they say legislators were sure to emphasize that they would be working on property tax in the future. That's going to be even more significant because, after all, you have to pass a balanced budget for this state of Texas for the next 2 years, and some of the income is not as significant as it was in the past because of the pandemic. I did see a video yesterday from State Senator Angela Paxton, who said that the comptroller said they have been able to collect a number of taxes from online sales and things like that, so maybe the shortfall isn't as great, but that's going to be a big issue, property tax. Number 5, one that Republicans have really forced on the legislature and want to promote, is a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying. That's where you actually pay for individuals, we'll just use Dallas as an example, to then, as you pay for them, they then go down to Austin and lobby on their behalf, maybe not on your behalf. And so they want to try to ban individuals being able to lobby when they're being funded by the taxpayers, because they're going to be asking for the legislature to fund more and more of what they do. And then, of course, a perennial issue has to do with the issue of guns. There are a number of gun-related issues here. Republicans proposing certain bills to defend so-called Second Amendment rights. Democrats proposing stricter firearm regulations. And a lot of that, of course, relates to what may or may not happen with a new Biden administration. So if nothing else, there are going to be some very significant votes. I think front and center you'll be hearing as the legislature begins to pull together some of their maps for redistricting, all sorts of hue and cry. And we've had Phil King on this program, for example, who is the heading up the committee that does that. And so that is certainly the case. Emergency powers, it might be time to get 1 or 2 of our conservative legislators on there to talk about what they're doing. So we'll see. Matt Krause maybe is a good one in that regard. And, of course, this whole issue of taxpayer-funded lobbying, property tax reform, and, of course, the issue of mail-in balloting. So it should be a much more intense Texas legislative session in light of the pandemic, in light of some of the controversy about the ballots, and a variety of other issues that have been around for some time, like, of course, property tax and gun control and all the rest. But then once you add redistricting to it, we could probably have a session almost every day on the state legislature, especially as we start getting into when some of those bills are actually filed and debated. But we'll spare you from that. But if nothing else, why don't you give you a preview of what's going to happen in the Texas legislature. Pretty amazing. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Let's see if we can maybe spend just a few minutes talking about the impeachment vote today. And then we will get to more of that in the National Hour. And just by the way, as kind of a program note, I did mention that about an hour from now, we'll have Michael Horton on with us, professor of systematic theology and apologetics. And then about 2 hours from now, we'll have Chuck Bentley on, who is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. And so what we have here are a series of votes and some major questions surrounding the idea of impeachment. As some of us have said off the air, we have really only 3 impeachments. This would be the 4th, and 2 of those are with Donald Trump. So you think about this, half of the impeachments of a president have happened to one individual. And of course, we can go through whether or not this was intended by the framers of the Constitution, whether all of this makes any sense. And so one of the articles I've posted, it's the last article there, I called it Questions and Possible Answers About the Impeachment. And this comes from Byron York. He's been on the program with us. It's been a while, but he actually tried to answer some of those questions. And one of those questions is, how do you remove an ex-president? Because after all, he says he's already gone. This is kind of a bizarre question posed by the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, in her desire to really try to prevent Donald Trump, I guess, from running again. Because if the goal of impeachment is that you are impeached and removed from office this time next week, he's out of office, right? Unless something changes here. So he actually takes some time to argue that the Constitution may or may not. Now, yesterday I mentioned there are a few individuals that we certainly respect. And that would be people like Andrew McCarthy, who says that if you look at British tradition, there are examples of individuals who were censured or impeached after they left office. Of course, that's British tradition. That's not American tradition, first of all. It's fair to say that the Supreme Court has never obviously had to rule on this as well. Then you have other people that say there's absolutely no way you can talk about removing the president from office when he's already removed from office. And so that's what the impeachment clause is all about. So, in the midst of this, Byron York, and by the way, that's an argument made by Alan Dershowitz, and my favorite line is, I have had some guests here that believe you can remove the president, others believe that you cannot, and these are all my guests, so I agree with my guests. In other words, we have people all over the map on this issue, but he does quote from another individual, Michael Horton, who is a judge who's been on the United States Appeals Court for the Fourth Circuit, in which he also argues that it just doesn't even make any sense to talk about impeaching and removing a person from office who's not in office. And he says the crux of my argument is the very purpose of the impeachment power was to remove an incumbent official. He says that seems to me to be crystal clear and inescapably true under the text of the Constitution itself. And again, if you want to go and look at it, it talks about, again, that the president, vice president, all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of, and all the list, treasury, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors. And it talks about the Senate will have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall indeed have an oath of affirmation. When the president of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall provide. And it just goes on to seemingly suggest that there is a president in office or vice president in office, a judge in office, a Supreme Court justice in office that would then be impeached by the House and then removed by the Senate. So the argument is, the plain meaning that we have there is that in the case of the president, this is designed to remove the president from office. But there is a secondary purpose, which many people are identifying, and that is to disqualify a removed president from ever holding federal office again. And so that is the argument that is sort of being floated right now, because as I pointed out, James Clyburn, who again is the House whip and certainly one of the more prominent individuals in the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, even has had this trial balloon about the fact that, well, we may call for the impeachment today and get this up or down vote today, but we won't even necessarily submit it to the Senate because, after all, you've had a couple of individuals, not the least of which Joe Biden himself, hinting that he'd kind of like to get some work done. And if you have the Senate holding a trial it makes it more difficult to even get the Senate to confirm your cabinet officers, gets it difficult to move forward any meaningful legislation. So we'll see where this goes. But another thing, that's kind of where people are now making that claim that they'll start the process now, and then after the president leaves office on January 20th, we'll wait maybe another 100 days or so to give Joe Biden kind of a chance to make his statement and to have an impact, and then we'll go from there. But even if that is the case, one of the things that, again, this individual, Michael Horton, who is a judge, said is that if that even began, it is quite likely, I think you could almost say it's a virtual certainty, that the lawyers associated with the president would actually challenge that, and they would take it at least to the U.S. Court of Appeals to the District of Columbia. And after that decision is made, maybe it would end up in the Supreme Court. So all of that to say that, first of all, it is unlikely, I think, that this goes anywhere other than for today. But it would be the second time this president will have been impeached. And you might then start saying, okay, what does the vote look like? Okay, I don't do this very often, but since some people have taken the time to dig these out, I'll share those with you. Last time when we had this taking place, you had at least 2 Democrats that did not vote to impeach the president. That would be Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey. You might remember him as a Democrat who then switched to the Republican Party after the impeachment, and then Representative Colin Peterson in Minnesota. So you had 2 Democrats at the time that did not vote for impeachment, and I thought we'd add one more because one of the people that's getting quite a bit of press these days is the former Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, who voted present, but nevertheless did not run again. And so, will you have any Democrats this time vote against impeachment? At this hour, I know of none. So all the Democrats would vote for impeachment. What about Republicans? Okay, last time you didn't have Republicans vote for it. This time, no doubt you will. I've already alluded to a few. One is Representative Lynn Cheney from Wyoming. Another one is John Katko of New York. Another one, pretty obvious, Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, who's been very critical of the president. Another one, Fred Upton of Michigan. And then Jamie Herrera Butler of Washington. So, again, there are 211 House Republicans. At least 5 of them, and maybe more, might vote to impeach, which is then, if nothing else, going to maybe be used by a number of people to say that this was a bipartisan action. It was really hard to say that it was bipartisan last time when you couldn't find anybody voting for impeachment on the Republican side, and you had a couple of Democrats voting against it. If it goes to the Senate, here's a big question. What will the Senate look like? Because, after all, we just had the Georgia election. I'll go into this in a little more detail in the national hour because we'll have our Georgia listeners there. But it does look like in Georgia, the election officials believe that as they are going back and counting the votes so they can certify the election, they might be able to certify that by as early as January 20th. Well, that's next Wednesday. And that, of course, is maybe 2 days before the official deadline, which would be January 22nd. But it's also a day after Senate returns from recess. So the Senate will return from recess, as best as I can determine, on January 19th. That will be mostly perfunctory kinds of things. And then those that want to attend the inauguration will do so on the 20th. And so as a result, that is the case. And so then once those 2 races are certified by Georgia, then that would mean that Senator Warnock, Senator Ossoff, right now Senator-elect, would then be sworn in, and you would have 50-50. You would also have an odd situation in which you have Kamala Harris as the senator who will now not be the senator, who would then have the ability to break a tie after the inauguration. I have not figured out exactly what that means. Does she then have to step down as a senator to be the vice president? And if that's the case, then do you still have a 50-50 because you have one individual? So there are still a few other things to think our way through, but nevertheless, just wanted to give you a little bit of a look on the impeachment which is taking place today. I'll get into that in a little more detail next hour, but I just wanted you to hear about that. And let's take a break, and when we come back, just a couple of comments. Now I'll actually get to the articles I posted here today on some very important things you need to know about. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just, if I can, talk about big tech censorship. And we've got 3 articles that I'll try to bang through pretty quickly. Might cover it a little bit more detail later. But one of the first ones is where there is a quote from Glenn Greenwald. Now, if that name sounds familiar, we have quoted him a number of times. Now, he is left-leaning. He has described himself as a liberal. He did not vote for Donald Trump. He has very strong concerns about some of the things Donald Trump has done. But he's also become a good example of a voice of reason, illustrating sometimes the difference between the left and liberals, because he's a classic liberal in the good sense of that. A liberal would say, look, I may disagree with you, but I don't believe that you should be censored. And he has really taken on the big tech companies. First of all, of course, you might remember that he actually ended up leaving the company, or essentially was forced forced out of a company that he helped found because he was so concerned about the fact that the New York Post did all they could to hide the stories about Hunter Biden and the laptop. And so as a result, some of his colleagues wanted to have a complete censorship of that story. And he just finally said he had to leave on his own. Well, Glenn Greenwald has said in the last 3 months, this is him, again, a liberal saying this. This is why I think it's more significant. In the last 3 months, tech giants have censored political speech and journalism to manipulate U.S. politics, banning reporting on the Bidens, removing the president, destroying a new competitor, that'd be Parler, while U.S. liberals with virtual unanimity have cheered. Pretty strong statement that he came out with yesterday. He then points out that the ACLU, that is the American Civil Liberties Union, said that the unity of Silicon Valley monopoly power to destroy Parler was deeply troubling. And he then goes on to point out that there are leaders in Germany, France, and Mexico, none of whom are really good friends of Donald Trump, to be blunt, who also have expressed their concern. And yet he says only U.S. liberals support it because of the dominant strain of U.S. liberalism is not economic socialism, but political authoritarianism. Again, I would like to say what you don't seem to understand, Glenn Greenwald, is there's a difference, as Dennis Prager has said, and we've said on this program, between the left and liberalism, nevertheless. One other post, and again, I could encourage you to read what are 3 pages, and I'm just reading a couple of the Twitter post by Glenn Greenwald, until they take him off, by the way. Watch, that'll happen. I guarantee it will happen. He says just 3 months ago, the Democratic-led House committee issued a major report warning of the dangers of the antitrust power of Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Left-wing scholars have been sounding the alarm for years. Now it's here, and liberals cheer. So he just reminds us that there were all sorts of investigations and concerns about the power of Silicon Valley. But as soon as you get the result that you wanted, everybody's cheering and nobody's warning about the potential danger. Which brings me to my second column, and that's by Cal Thomas. Cal Thomas talks about the fact that Twitter and Facebook have permanently banned President Trump from their social platforms. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, attorney Sidney Powell have also been permanently banned as Twitter announced a purge of accounts dedicated to sharing content related to the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory. And so then they point out that when that happened, Donald Trump said, okay, well, I don't have my Twitter account, but I do have the president's account. This is an account which will now be available next week to Joe Biden. And he then actually used what's called the POTUS account, President of the United States. And as soon as he posted something on that, they pulled his as well. And all he had at that time said is the alternative social media platform favored by conservatives now finds it virtually homeless on the internet as Amazon, Apple, and Google have booted it off. That was enough to pull him off even the political and the presidential Twitter account. So now think this through. You may dislike Donald Trump, but you have to at least respect the office. And if the office of the president is one that has this particular Twitter account, which, by the way, will transfer, as far as I understand, from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. If you can pull that account just because you don't like what the president had to say, or you use the excuse that he might incite violence. By the way, is there anything in that Twitter post at all that could be seen as inciting violence? And the answer, of course, is no. It just illustrates, again, what I think you are starting to see. Even our liberal friends who might disagree with most of the things we talk about around this table are concerned. Don't take it from me. Let's now go to Cal Thomas's quote from the American Civil Liberties Union, which has also expressed concern about this. In a statement, Kate Ruan, who is the senior legislative counsel for the ACLU, said, "We understand the desire to permanently suspend him now, President of the United States, but it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for speech of billions, especially when political realities make decisions easier." And so, again, he goes on to talk about how this has begun to play out and, of course, how it sometimes is very similar to some of the kinds of things that have happened, and also just the double standard, because right now you have the Iranian leadership, as we pointed out yesterday, people associated with the Chinese Communist Party that still have their accounts at a time when, of course, they're being pulled from not only the president, but the president's associates. And one last point, and I thank K.D. Pavlich for this one, because I first heard about this when I was actually watching a commentary by Tucker Carlson, that Twitter has an actual public policy division. You know, Twitter's now larger than most companies in some respects. Facebook is larger than most companies. So now they have kind of like a Secretary of State. They have a public policy division. Can you believe that? And so anyway, the Twitter public policy division actually posted this. Ahead of the election in Uganda, we're hearing reports that internet service providers are being ordered to block social media and messaging apps. We strongly condemn internet shutdowns. They are hugely harmful, violate basic human rights and the principles of the open internet. And the level of irony is just hard to reach. You know, they are very upset about the possibility that some of these internet service providers in Uganda are preventing certain kind of information from being released just before the elections in Uganda. And if you don't see the irony, well, you know, I've done what I can. But here's a couple more. The other post that came out also, quote, access to information and freedom of expression, including public conversation on Twitter, is never more important than during the democratic processes, particularly during elections. And as Katie Pavlich says, does this standard apply to the United States? Apparently not. This one coming out as well. The CEO of Parler, if you're not sure who he is, it's John Matze, says, Tucker, they, that is Amazon, Apple, Google, all did the same thing on the same day. We found out first in some cases from BuzzFeed. We didn't get a notice from Google. We read it in the news. He says the last thing we have at Parler is email. He says, I bet they'll shut that off within the next 24 hours. Don't know that they have, but it just illustrates again, just even the lack of self-reflection and not even understanding the amount of irony when you're criticizing internet service providers in Uganda for blocking certain kind of social media when you've been blocking it here in the United States. This is not a left-right issue, fortunately, because we have liberals like Glenn Greenwald and certainly organizations like the ACLU saying this is a problem. So if nothing else, I'm going to be writing about that, not only in some commentaries, but I think we're going to even have an Outlook series of articles on this in the future. But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll have our National Hour. We'll talk about this idea of impeachment, and we'll talk with Michael Horton about some of these dangerous ideas being expressed in some of these public forums, and we as Christians need to speak out and teach good, solid theology. We'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we are so grateful that you could join us today. Going to have a couple of guests over the next couple of hours, but we're also going to be looking at a lot of issues in the news. First up, a couple of articles that I've posted on this whole issue of big tech censorship, so we'll focus on that first. Then, of course, this is a vote today on what would be the second impeachment of the president, and what that means and where that goes, and who would maybe vote for and against it, and whether or not it can even continue on in the Senate, and a variety of other issues. So those are some of the articles we've posted. Then at the bottom of this hour, we're going to be talking with Michael Horton. He a while back wrote about some of the, if you will, theological concerns that surfaced in the Jericho March. Not so much the march, but the event afterwards. And we've talked about that with Rod Dreyer. And I want to maybe focus on that, not because that is anything other than in the past. It's in the rearview mirror. Why even bring it up? But it, I think, illustrates a broader point, and that is, no matter what happens with Donald Trump, if this time next week he kind of fades into the distance, I doubt it, but if he does, these concerns, these theological errors and things that were said still remain. And so it's important for us as Christians to take some time to say, let's reevaluate some of the things that have been said in some of these public events by individuals who are Christians. And again, we certainly recognize that there are places where people can disagree, but I think as you're going to go into some of these, you'll see that a few of these are issues where there's almost unanimous agreement among Christians about some of these concerns. So we're going to talk about that with him. Now, you may want to take a shot or two at people that voted for Donald Trump or not, although his article says, no, I'm not really having any issue about who you voted for, but I am having an issue with theological issues. And since he's a professor of systematic theology and apologetics, that's the kind of stuff we do here on Point of View. Then we'll come back on the next hour, get into a couple of other issues, maybe come back to some of the very significant issues being raised by this big tech censorship. And also, my commentary today is about, if you will, the possibility that we are heading into a possible death spiral in terms of public life. And I will get into that a little bit later, but it's one of the commentaries I've posted, because there are people that are sort of trend watchers saying, because of the pandemic and because of the lockdown, there are some issues. Also, I'm going to say a little bit about vaccines and the vaccine distribution and some of that. And then before the next hour is up, Chuck Bentley will be with us, and we're going to get some advice from him as an individual who's the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries about how to order our finances. You know, we just got hit with a pandemic and a lockdown that has really devastated a lot of us. And in some respects, he's got a very good piece on how to prepare if we ever have another pandemic or we have any other kind of economic downturn. And again, some of this is just wise financial advice. He also has a book coming out, so we'll talk about that as well. So there are just a lot of topics that we will try to cover just in these next 2 hours. Don't forget that we will come back tomorrow to get into more of these issues if you'd like to discuss them. And of course, Friday is our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford will be with us. Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us. Some of you wondered about Penna Dexter. She had been exposed to a family member that had COVID-19. So just out of an attempt to keep her safe and all of us safe, we won't be seeing her for a little while, but we're looking forward to getting her back in studio as soon as we can. So that's kind of the platform. Let's get into it. The first article I've posted, I actually called Big Tech Censorship. And what it is a piece by Beth Bauman, who actually gives us a number of quotes from Glenn Greenwald. You might say, okay, I think I've heard that name. Who is that? Well, he is a liberal. He is left-leaning. He's a journalist and a lawyer. He's an individual that does not like Donald Trump, did not vote for Donald Trump, probably disagrees with a number of things that the Trump campaign did and the Trump administration did. But he has become almost a voice of reason in the midst of this. You might remember, if you remember his name from the past, he was the one who had actually formed a separate company so that this media organization could cover stories that oftentimes were shut down by big media. And he was the one that spoke out about the shutdown from big media and big tech of the New York Post story of Hunter Biden's laptop. And it caused such a stir that even though it was a company he helped to co-found, he was pretty much pushed out. I don't know if he was fired, whether he jumped, whether he was shoved, but the bottom line, he's not there any longer. And so he's been very accurately, and I think very wisely, reminding us of what is taking place. So let me just read one or two of his tweets that you can see in this article, because just the other day he actually said, in the last 3 months, tech giants have censored political speech and journalism to manipulate U.S. politics, banning reporting on the Bidens, just referred to that, removing the president, you know that, and destroying a new competitor, which would be Parler, while U.S. liberals with virtual unanimity have cheered. He goes on to even, in another tweet, say the ACLU, that'd be the American Civil Liberties Union, said that the unity of Silicon Valley monopoly power to destroy Parler was deeply troubling. He goes on to say that leaders in Germany, France, and Mexico, these are leaders that may not necessarily agree with Donald Trump, but nevertheless have protested about some of the things that are happening and have happened within this last week here with this big tech monopolistic censorship. And he says only U.S. liberals support it because the dominant strain of U.S. liberalism is not economic socialism, but political authoritarianism. If I ever met Glenn Greenwald, I'd say, I think what you need to do is make a distinction here between U.S. liberalism and the left. Because as you've heard me say before, Dennis Prager makes a distinction between the left, which wants to censor you, and liberals like him that says, look, I may disagree with your viewpoint, but I don't think that we should allow people to censor your viewpoint. Then he mentions one more thing before we take a break. He said just 3 months ago, the Democratic-led House committee actually issued a major report warning of the dangers of the antitrust power of Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And he says left-wing scholars have been sounding the alarm for years. But now that it's here, the liberals cheer. And so this goes on really for about 3 pages or more, actually 4 pages if you print it on that next one, of all the different posts. I just read a few of those here in which he's talked about how social media monopolies have been censoring for some time, how when people had this happen, they simply did not care. And then it even has on his 3rd page here from his newsletter in which he goes into more detail about some of the various posts that have been put forward by various liberals and Democrats in the Congress, individuals really calling for, as much as they possibly can, a censoring and those kinds of things. And so as a result, he just really tries to help us understand that this was at one point a real concern surfaced by a number of Democrats. But as soon as they got the answer that they want, that is, let's not only punish Donald Trump, but anybody associated with him, they're all cheering, when just a few months ago, they were expressing some concern. We'll continue our conversation about big tech censorship right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Brian Walsh writes about the future for Axios. Before that, he was a correspondent with Time magazine. He isn't necessarily looking at issues from a Christian perspective, even though his most recent book has the title End Times. He recently wrote about the death spiral of public life. While he acknowledges that technology has kept many people working, fed, and entertained at home, it has forced a retreat from public life that will have what he predicts will be toxic ramifications. As I have documented in previous commentaries, the slight benefit of the lockdowns is overshadowed by the tremendous cost in terms of social, economic, and educational devastation. As a Christian, I would also add that keeping believers from meeting together in church will also have negative consequences. The impact on cities could be significant. One recent report that he cites found that 3 to 4 times more people will end up working remotely than before the pandemic. This would have a profound impact on urban economies, transportation, and consumer spending. Consider that nearly 14% of the office space in Midtown Manhattan is vacant. Both public schools and public transportation seem headed for a death spiral. Frustrated parents withdraw their kids from school, thus affecting funding, which is based on a per-student basis. Public transportation has been crippled with declining ridership as more and more people decide to work remotely. And funding is declining because of plunging state and local government revenue. As technology improves, so will the benefits of staying home. You can work when you want, watch what you want, and eat what you want without leaving your home. All of this will certainly decrease our sense of community. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, let's, if we can, talk a little bit more about big tech censorship, and then we'll get into the issue of impeachment. Then Michael Horton will be with us at the bottom of the hour. A second article I've posted by Cal Thomas, again, reminds us that Twitter and Facebook have permanently banned President Trump from their social platforms, as well as former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and attorney Sidney Powell and others. So that is the case. But then points out the fact that once they banned the president from his own personal Twitter account, then the president, Donald Trump, used his POTUS account. That is the account that is given to the president of the United States. POTUS stands for President of the United States. And within minutes, they shut that one down because he put out this Twitter post in which he talked about the fact that an alternative social media platform favored by conservatives now find itself virtually homeless on the internet as Amazon, Apple, and Google have all booted it from the platforms in a span of less than 24 hours. Now, again, the argument for why they banned Donald Trump is that they did not want to risk further incitement of violence. We can get into whether or not that is a legitimate argument. That gets into, of course, the article of impeachment that we see right now. But I'll leave that for the moment. I don't think anybody looking at that could even conclude that that is the case. And you have to understand that when you all of a sudden close down that account, that is actually the account of the President of the United States. I mean, this time next week, Joe Biden will be using that Twitter account if he wants to use it. He doesn't have to, but he can. And so you've got some real concerns starting to surface as each particular step is taken and there are no repercussions. But again, Cal Thomas reminds us that some of the people that have expressed concern are groups that may disagree with a lot of things we talk about around this table. That would be the American Civil Liberties Union, he says, who have expressed concern over the action by social media giants. In a statement, Katie Ruan, who is the ACLU's senior legislative counsel, said, "We understand the desire to permanently suspend him now," which would be the president, "but it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter yield the unchecked power to remove people from their platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions, especially when political realities make those decisions easier." Cal Thomas goes on and talks about some other aspects of that. Quotes from Nat Hendorf, who used, of course, was very much with the ACLU, and then talks about the double standard, of course, because if indeed you're concerned about incitement to violence, you still have these Twitter platforms available to the Iranian dictatorship, still available to people associated with the Chinese Communist Party and a number of others. So it once again just illustrates what is taking place right now. And one other one I'll get to before we get into the issue of impeachment, which is kind of front and center, and that is the irony of all of this. Katie Pavlich has done a good job of reminding us that, first of all, Twitter, Facebook, some of these social media giants are bigger than countries. And so as a result, Twitter has its own public policy division. Can you believe that? It's like they have their own State Department. Anyway, the Twitter Public Policy Division put this out yesterday. Ahead of the election in Uganda, we're hearing reports that internet service providers are being ordered to block social media and messaging apps. We strongly condemn internet shutdowns. They are hugely harmful, violate basic human rights and the principles of an open internet. You mean sort of like what you've been doing for at least this last week. One of the other posts from the Twitter Public Policy Division: access to information and freedom of expression, including the public conversation on Twitter, is never more important than during the democratic processes, particularly elections. And as Katie Pavlich says, does this apply to the United States? Apparently not. And if you don't see the irony there, I can't really help you, but it seems pretty obvious to most of us that that is the case. And then goes on to point out the fact that one of the Twitter posts that came out about what happened to Parler from the CEO, John Matzey, is that he says they, that is Amazon, Apple, and Google, did all of this on the same day. We found out first about it in some cases from BuzzFeed. We didn't get notice from Google. We read it in the news. He says the last thing we have right now at Parler is email, and I bet they will shut that off too in 24 hours. Don't know that they have, but it just illustrates again what is really unprecedented. And this has been a year of so many things unprecedented. I guess we should not be surprised, but we'll come back to this a little bit later because I know that front and center right now is a vote on the impeachment. And so first of all, let's kind of get a handle on what that looks like right now, because first of all, the vote is going to probably definitely be along partisan lines. Last time when there was a vote on impeachment, you might remember there were two Democrats who voted against the first article of impeachment. That would be Representative Jeff Van Dew from New Jersey, who actually afterwards switched to the Republican Party, and Representative Colin Peterson from Minnesota. And to be fair, let's also mention that former Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii voted present. At this point, it doesn't look like any Democrat has expressed any opposition to voting for impeachment this time against Donald Trump. But last time you were hard put to find a Republican voting for it. As of the moment, I think you can come up with at least 5 Republicans that support voting for impeachment. That would be Representative Lynn Cheney from Wyoming. I think you know that one. John Katko from New York. Another obvious one, Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, because he's been quite vocal about that. Fred Upton of Michigan. And Jamie Herrera Butler from Washington. So at least 5 out of the 211 House Republicans. Just a handful, but it might be used by some to say that this was a bipartisan impeachment, unlike last time. But the real question is, where does it go? Because, okay, you have the vote for impeachment today. Will you have a trial in the Senate before the president is leaving office? And the answer seems to be no. Don't see any evidence of that. And so I posted an article that was put together, and I kind of called it a question and suggested answers from Byron York of the Washington Examiner, because the question is, how do you remove an ex-president? He's already gone. This is kind of the question that was raised even by the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, because of the argument that, well, we need to move forward quickly. But that's probably not going to happen for a variety of reasons. And so some said, well, even though the president has left office, you could at least in the future have a trial in the United States Senate. Now, there are some people that have really questioned that, and there are some that have supported that. Andrew McCarthy is a good example. This particular one has a very good series of quotes from Michael Lettig, who is a judge, has been a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, in which he actually says that the crux of his argument is that the very purpose of the impeachment power is to remove an incumbent official. That seems to be crystal clear when you look at the text of the Constitution. And so if the design of the impeachment was to impeach and remove a president from office, when the president is removed, that's sort of the end of discussion. Now, you got some Democrats that are actually claiming that they could start the impeachment now after the president has left office. Maybe they could finish it up. You know, Representative James Clyburn, who's kind of the third-ranking Democrat, I mentioned that the other day, has said that maybe they would even wait for a while. As you might remember, they did not deliver the articles of impeachment to the Senate until after a period of time, and this could take place, and there may be some reasons for that, not the least of which is incoming President Joe Biden would kind of like to get something done. So that's when you had James Clyburn suggesting that maybe they'd wait at least 100 days so that you could have some of the legislative action taking place, maybe get the confirmation of many, if not most, of the cabinet officers, which they have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. But, of course, if indeed any of that was to proceed, this particular article also points out that it's quite likely that indeed the lawyers for the president would bring this to court, to at least the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and it might even go to the Supreme Court, because we've never had a ruling on this. And, of course, to even assume that you could find 17 Republicans along with 50 Democrats to all indeed vote for removal from office, which would be kind of silly since he's already out of office, it would be kind of crazy. And, of course, there's one other question for those of you in Georgia, and I'll talk more about that later. When will Senators Warnock and Ossoff actually take power? According to the Georgia election officials, they may be able to confirm that by January 20th, but it would suggest that they probably would not even be in the Senate until after, of course, the inauguration. And we'll talk more about what that might mean a little bit later. But I thought it would be good to look at some of the questions that Michael Horton has raised when he saw some of the speeches given after the Jericho March, because, you know, some of those concerns still exist, whether Donald Trump is in office or not. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We're going to come back and look at some of the theological concerns that have surfaced in some of these events. And a while back, Michael Horton actually wrote about some of the concerns he saw in the speeches given after the Jericho March. Now, we've had Rod Dreyer on here a couple of times, first of all, to talk about his book, Live Not by Lies. And last time, we even spent a segment talking about some of the things that were said as speeches. But we're not going to focus right now, as we did maybe with him, or even last week when we had David French on on this program about the election, voting for or against Donald Trump, or even the election outcome, there's something broader, and that is some of the theological comments and dare I even say some of these theological concerns and errors that I think really need to be addressed. And I thought that Michael Horton, in his piece, identified a couple of those: Christian Americanism, end times conspiracy, and the prosperity gospel. And I really wanted to focus on some of those because, especially as you go through some of those, you'd have to say that many of those individuals, no matter whether they found themselves in the never Trump category or the pro-Trump category, I think as evangelical leaders would say some of these are concerns that we need to address. So anyway, Michael Horton joins us. He is a professor of systematic theology and apologetics at Westminster Seminary there in California, author of more than 30 books. Certainly have enjoyed him over the years, reading him. I remember, of course, his White Horse Inn radio show, and he's the editor-in-chief of White Horse Inc. And Michael Horton, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's great to be back with you again, Kerby. Thanks for having me on.
Always had such respect for you. And I was just saying to my producer, how did we missed not getting you on more often? So we will try to rectify that because it was no intended slight. But I found that article and said exactly what we need. And let's just face it, by this time next week, maybe Donald Trump fades into obscurity. I doubt it. Or he's certainly not president. But there are some really significant trends. And as you identified some of those trends, I think of people we've had on the program. I mentioned David Prince, Rod Dreyer, Temporal Longman, that would be very critical of people that have supported Donald Trump. But on the other hand, I've had people in studio like Eric Metaxas, Franklin Graham, Jim Garlow, Robert Jeffress, who would be much more supportive. But as I look through your list, let's maybe work our way through that. They'll take the easy one first. I would think most of those leaders would have a real concern about this idea of the prosperity gospel. Yet you use that opportunity to talk about those speeches after the Jericho March to say, you know, we're starting to see that surface, and that's not something that most evangelical Christians endorse and actually have written about and spoken out against. What are your thoughts?
Sure, Kerby. Well, thank you for framing it this way. Yeah, I definitely, I've written a couple of articles, one for the Washington Post, another for Christianity Today, over the last 6 years about what I see as a dangerous confluence of two different streams, and that is the sort of more traditional conservative evangelical stream with the more sort of neo-Pentecostal prosperity gospel stream. And you look back at the old days of Trinity Broadcasting Network in its heyday, and you had, for example, the self-esteem gospel, Norman Vincent Peale, and then handed on to Robert Schuller, and then the prosperity gospel, all kind of mingling there. So you had somebody like Robert Schuller who didn't believe in speaking in tongues or in continuing revelation, much less, name it, claim it, but still having a very closely aligned view that God wants us all, God exists basically to make us happy. Both of those traditions are rooted actually in late 19th century mind science cults, like Christian Science and other sort of hermetic movements, esoteric trends. And so when I saw Paula White and a number of other people I could identify as part of this circle of what's called faith teaching, Kenneth Copeland, that whole name it, claim it theology, mixing with the president's own influence, such as it is, from Norman Vincent Peale directly, it all made sense. That there's a confluence here of a very human-centered theology that even people like some of those you named, Franklin Graham, Robert Jeffress, and others, even those who wouldn't buy into necessarily faith healing and that sort of thing. They're all basically finding their ground level of support in a political system that uses Christian symbols and Christian language. If they were all simply saying, hey, we're a coalition of people from different, religious backgrounds who support the president's policies, that's one thing. But I believe using Christ as a mascot for an essentially political program infused with a prosperity gospel.
And one of the things that you mentioned just a minute ago in passing is kind of the prophetic aspect, and maybe that gets into some of the whole end times comments you make as well. But we've had Michael Brown on this program, and he more recently has raised questions about some of those individuals that said, God gave me a vision that Donald Trump would be reelected. And Michael Brown, even in that article that I quoted the other day, and I think I quoted it when we had Rod Dreyer on, said, look, I'm known as kind of the apologist of the charismatic movement or the Pentecostal movement, but I'm right now starting to call on some of these individuals that were making these declarative statements that for certain Donald Trump will be reelected. And in some respects, that's an issue, even within the charismatic movement, Pentecostal movement right now, because you had a lot of people making that claim. And again, I don't know how much of the speeches that you saw there after the Jericho March, but I heard that a couple of times as well. And that should be raising a concern, whether you're a charismatic or not, whether you're a Pentecostal or not, because indeed these people were making very declarative statements about prophetic visions that they said that they had that don't look like they're going to take place here in the next week or so.
Yeah, I mean, you know what happened in the Old Testament to false prophets. If the prophecy didn't come true, the so-called prophet was stoned. And it's a good thing we're living in the New Covenant.
And Michael Brown even said, it's too bad that the prophets there didn't think about saying, oh, well, maybe you didn't pray enough. And he says, don't give me that argument. So, I appreciate the fact that even though Michael Brown and we've had relationships, I've interviewed him, and we may theologically have some disagreements, I appreciate him really kind of pushing his fellow prophetic people by saying, wait a minute, you made some statements and they didn't come true. And now I'm still running into people, which gets us into the whole question of end times conspiracy, of people saying, oh, but you just wait. Next Wednesday, Donald Trump is going to be putting his hand on the Bible, or maybe it won't happen then, but I'm hearing people say by March he will be there. And oh my goodness, Insurrection Act and all sorts of other things, and QAnon, and there's just a sense in which maybe we're just wanting to get a little more common sense in the evangelical world, don't you think?
Absolutely. And for this to happen, Kerby, I think it means that, I really appreciate people like Michael Brown standing up within the Pentecostal community and saying, hey, this is really giving what we believe a bad name. At the same time, I think there's something deeper here, and it's not the charismatic anti-charismatic divide necessarily. It's this idea that that this is a Christian nation.
Yes, I was going to get to that.
There is no and God has at various points given us figures who are quasi-messianic. Now, I know a lot of these folks would say, no, Jesus is our king and Donald Trump is our president. Nevertheless, in their rhetoric and a lot of their symbols that they use, it becomes very difficult to distinguish Jesus from Donald Trump.
Let me jump in real quickly because we have one of those monetary breaks, but when we come back, I want to get into that because, I've said it before, there's only one chosen nation, that was Israel, only chosen people, but there's a sense in which America is exceptional, but this exceptionalism has gone too far, and I want to get into that because that was another one of your points, and I want to continue that conversation with Michael Horton right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Michael Horton today. And again, a lot of this fits under the category of Proverbs 27:6, the wounds of a friend, because we are fellow Christians who recognize that it's important for us to think biblically. But I want to come back to this idea that you talk about, Michael, of Christian Americanism. And I was trying to think of the way to illustrate this, but every once in a while when I'm speaking, sometimes during the question and answer period, somebody will quote some verse in the Old Testament. And I usually start off by saying, well, we have to recognize that that verse applies to the Old Testament in Israel, not to America. And as soon as I say that, I can guarantee there will be a half a dozen heads that'll snap up like, what do you mean by that? And that, I think, illustrates kind of what you're getting at, because of the fact that there is sort of, if you will, sometimes in some of these circles, a Christian Americanism that puts almost kind of a messianic emphasis on some of our leadership. And we shouldn't really do that as Christians, should we?
No, definitely not. We've had this in our history, Kerby, as you know. Abraham Lincoln was a Redeemer president. There were the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It is a stirring rendition of the final return of Christ and his final judgment. Really, the Civil War, the triumph of the Republic and the Civil War is the consummation of biblical prophecy, and Jesus is really the Union Army in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We have this whole history, long history, both in the North and the South. The difference now is that there's a real fusion here with a kind of, let's say, resentment of white Christians in particular, against them, whoever they are. And I think a lot of it is racism, but a lot of it, too, is the stark contrast with what, public educators are trying to shove down everybody's throat. And there's a Manichaean light versus darkness going on right here. We don't talk to each other. We talk about each other. We get in our social media silos and just get in an echo chamber and fire each other up until we're in a frenzy. This idea of a Christian America makes sense in one way when you think of the fact that the majority of people in America have identified as Christians until fairly recently. That tide is now turning, yes. And so that's why there's a lot of fear and resentment. But theologically, biblically, we can come back and say, that's okay. There never has been a Christian nation except for, as you say, Israel. God took Israel to himself. What other nation is so great as to have God as its king? God is ultimately sovereign over America, but he's not the king of America the way he was the king of Israel, ruling directly and immediately, giving us a constitution. Men wrote the Constitution, and it's an imperfect document. It's a wonderful document, but it's not inspired. It's not inerrant. We have a republic that has always needed reforms and has always has always been a secular nation, even with a lot of Christians in it. There is no Christian nation on earth. And so once we accept that, biblically, that there's one Christian nation, which is actually a spiritual nation, Revelation 5:9, taken from every tribe, kindred, tongue, people, and nation, that priesthood, that universal priesthood, that universal nation is the only Christian nation there is in the world today. So when we identify any particular country today with the kingdom of Christ, what we're essentially doing is what went wrong in Christendom when, people lopped off the heads of Muslims yelling Jesus is Lord and imagining that we could have a capital somewhere on earth for the kingdom of Christ. The capital for the kingdom of Christ is the right hand of the Father where Jesus sits as our king. And so that kingdom progresses through the preaching of the gospel, baptism, the Lord's Supper, and as Jesus adds in the Great Commission, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And lo, I am with you even. There is no kingdom of God on earth, but that kingdom that was inaugurated when Jesus rose from the dead and gave his disciples the Great Commission.
What would you say to some of the pastors listening right now? Because it seems to me that you've identified some issues, and it seems to me from the pulpit, maybe we need to say, our churches need to get back to what is biblical and what is Christian. For missionaries, make sure that we're actually presenting the true gospel, not an American view of the gospel or American culture. And so in some respects, that's been the task before every generation, and I think you've identified some concerns. So what would you say in the few minutes we have left to pastors or Bible teachers or Sunday school teachers or small group leaders to begin to bring people back to God's Word and away from some of these false ideas?
Absolutely. Yeah, on one hand, we have responsibility, of course, as citizens of this great republic to exercise that citizenship wisely, to be engaged, to make our views known, to vote, and to express our views. But our ultimate citizenship is in heaven, and so I would encourage pastors especially say, look, our job as ministers is not to tell people how to vote. Our job is not to get people all riled up with fear when Jesus said, "Fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." We're not building a kingdom here on earth. This kingdom is a gift, and the King has given it at the cost of his own blood. So I guess my final encouragement would be, especially to pastors, don't be CNN pastors or Fox pastors. Be biblical pastors. Don't be sucked in to whatever social media or news outlet silo you happen to turn on immediately when you want to find out what's going on. Don't be obsessed with the news. There's better news from a better country that your people need to hear every week.
Let me just mention, too, if you find yourself saying, boy, I love the insight of Michael Horton, we have a link to whitehorseinn.org, and you can listen to, of course, the broadcast, and that will take you to the other websites as well. A very good tribute, by the way, to J.I. Packer I saw that you had there, as well as all sorts of different articles, some of which we've alluded to and others. And if nothing else, this is something that I want to continue to look at. As you know, you're not the only person I've had coming on talking about this. We've been talking with Rod Dreyer about that. Last week, David French. We're going to get a whole bunch of other people because these are trends that continue on and they surface in some of these events. And that's why I appreciate your theological perspective on that. So, Michael Horton, thank you for joining us. It's been too long, and I'm looking forward to the next opportunity. If we can, take a break, and when we come back, we will spend a little bit more time getting into a couple of other issues. And I might just mention that before the next hour is up, we have Chuck Bentley on with us, CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. So let me real quickly mention that we'll also open up the phones. Again, we are trying to think through some of these very important issues. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We come back, I want to get into this division that he's been talking about and others have been talking about, because that is part of the problem, but also my commentary on, if you will, what is happening on what could be even a death spiral of public life. We've got some real important issues to address in the 21st century. How do we think about them as Christians? We'll be back to talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Had a bit of a problem with our phone, so we may not be able to get your phone calls on right away, but hopefully we'll be able to talk with Chuck Bentley at the bottom of the hour. But nevertheless, let me keep going down the road because there's some things that you need to know about. And one of those, before we get into the division in America and some of the other very important issues that we've surfaced in the interview last hour, I thought I would make just a comment or two about the vaccine. Of time to time, I want to bring out concerns or issues about that because, unfortunately, sometimes it isn't covered very well by the press. Or if you listen to local media, they'll just be talking about some of the problems of vaccine distribution. The national press sometimes is moving on to other issues. It's certainly going to be completely overshadowed by conversations about the impeachment and others. And yet, for those of you that want to get the vaccine or have questions about it, I want to try to cover it. And so I'm going to do that real quickly and then move on. And that is, first of all, the editorial board, interestingly enough, the Wall Street Journal have said, some of the bureaucracy has not been helpful. And so yesterday, the Trump administration said that it will release vaccine doses that have been held back for second inoculations, and they'll send more inoculations and vaccine doses to states so that they can be administering them faster. That's something that certainly needs to take place. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, who is still in office, although many of the Trump cabinet have now stepped down, he said every vaccine dose that is sitting in a warehouse rather than going into an arm could mean one more life lost or one more hospital bed occupied. So again, they recognize that they have about 27 million vaccine doses. Only about 9.3 million of those have been shipped to the states that have been administered. So by holding them back, it makes some sense. But at the same time, let's get them into people as quickly as possible. By the way, I'm going to have something to say about that second inoculation in just a minute. But one of the things that has been a problem is that you have had some states, let me pick on New York for just a minute, that have been actually coming up with these complex formulas. They want to try to focus on equity. So that sometimes involves race and ethnicity. Of course, then you have all these factors like risk factors, age, occupation, hospital department, all these kinds of things, which have been a mess. And so there's been kind of a pushback. I'll just use New York as an example, but there have been in other states as well. And so Governor Andrew Cuomo on Monday said that they were going to expand eligibility for seniors over the age of 65, as well as public safety officers, teachers, other school staff, and the rest. And then Tuesday, he even added them for those under the age of 65 and older. And so that's, I think, a statement that needs to be made, because my argument would be start with the oldest first. Is there a reason for that? Oh, let's go back to trust the science. Here's a piece. One estimate is that a 70-year-old is about 4 times more likely to die than a 60-year-old from COVID-19. So is age a factor? You think? Of course it is. And 7 times more likely to die than a 50-year-old. So again, if you're 70 years of age, and I'm getting close to that now, you can see that you're 4 times more likely to die than a 60-year-old, 7 times more likely to die than a 50-year-old. So age is a very significant factor, as is, of course, underlying health conditions like diabetes. So the argument being made by at least the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal is there's no reason that you have to push forward a 25-year-old teacher or grocery worker to get a shot before somebody who's 65 or 70. Okay, so that's a possibility as well. And so these are some important issues to address. One more point about the vaccine. I was going to say this a week ago, but I wanted to make sure I could find some very good articles that back this up. I've been hearing anecdotally from individuals that are receiving the second inoculation, the second dose, that they've had a more intense reaction. Now you're starting to see some of these actually surfacing, and I wanted to alert you to that for all sorts of reasons. The Illinois Department of Public Health director, for example, said the second dose of the coronavirus vaccine is creating a more intense reaction with some individuals. There tends to be, as she says, a more robust immune response that is manifested in the second dose. She went on to add that people should not be alarmed when individuals have reported more symptoms with the second shot and should know that these reactions are expected. So I wanted to mention that. There are some theories that people are working with. I don't know if any of those have been validated yet, but you can imagine, think about this hypothetically for a minute. If you have maybe already had the virus, maybe you were asymptomatic. You didn't even know that you had the virus, but your body has built up these antibodies. The first dose goes in, and those increase your number of antibodies maybe to 100%. And then a couple of weeks later, when you get your second dose, it puts you over 100%. And I mean, I've seen some people saying that they feel headache, they feel pain. Some people are sick for the day. I've heard a few people saying they're sometimes down for the count for 4 days. That shouldn't scare you off. If nothing else, that reaction illustrates that your body is working with those. But I haven't seen too many people. I found this article from Illinois. I found one from San Diego. Found another couple of health officials that have mentioned this. And I thought, as we like to always do and like to always cover, these are important issues that we think we should address here on Point of View. And so I wanted you to know about that. And as we know more, we'll let you know more. And maybe this is the first you've heard about the fact that some people, when they get that second dose, have a more intense reaction. So if that can be a public service we provide to you, so be it. Just before we take a break, let me mention that my commentary today is called Public Life, and in particular, it's written by Brian Walsh, who writes for Axios. He used to be a writer for Time magazine, and he's looking at that really pretty much just from kind of a trend point of view. He's not necessarily looking at it from a Christian point of view, although, interesting enough, his most recent book's called End Times, but he's not talking about the millennium or a tribulation or anything like that. He's just talking about his concern that we are moving into what could become a death spiral in public life. Let me take one example before we take a break, and then you can listen to my commentary right now if you happen to be online, because one report shows that anywhere from 3 times to 4 times more people will end up working remotely. That's possible because of the technology. That may be a good thing, but it's going to have a profound impact, he says, on urban economies, transportation, consumer spending. He points out, for example, in New York, that 40% of the office space in Midtown Manhattan is vacant. And you can see how this could affect kind of what you might call a death spiral in public education. Fewer people riding public transportation, more needs to try to even provide more funding at a time when you don't have funding because of the downturn in the economy. And some of you may live in places where public transportation is not that important to you, but in other places it may be absolutely crucial inside a city. You can see the same thing with public schools. As more and more kids are learning online, the parents say, I'm going to get them in the private school. And when you're paying and providing funding on a per student basis, you can see some of those concerns. All of that just to point out that we're going to be watching those trends and recognize that we're headed towards what many people call a new normal. And normal may look very different than what it did this time last year. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Brian Walsh writes about the future for Axios. Before that, he was a correspondent with Time magazine. He isn't necessarily looking at issues from a Christian perspective, even though his most recent book has the title End Times. He recently wrote about the death spiral of public life. While he acknowledges that technology has kept many people working, fed, and entertained at home, it has forced a retreat from public life that will have what he predicts will be toxic ramifications. As I have documented in previous commentaries, the slight benefit of the lockdowns is overshadowed by the tremendous cost in terms of social, economic, and educational devastation. As a Christian, I would also add that keeping believers from meeting together in church will also have negative consequences. The impact on cities could be significant. One recent report that he cites found that 3 to 4 times more people will end up working remotely than before the pandemic. This would have a profound impact on urban economies, transportation, and consumer spending. Consider that nearly 14% of the office space in Midtown Manhattan is vacant. Both public schools and public transportation seem headed for a death spiral. Frustrated parents withdraw their kids from school, thus affecting funding, which is based on a per-student basis. Public transportation has been crippled with declining ridership as more and more people decide to work remotely. And funding is declining because of plunging state and local government revenue. As technology improves, so will the benefits of staying home. You can work when you want, watch what you want, and eat what you want without leaving your home. All of this will certainly decrease our sense of community. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, I think we got our phone problem fixed. 1-800-351-1212. Let me just, as a program note, mention, because our first caller wants to talk about some of the questions about the election, that tomorrow we're going to have on the program with us Dr. William Briggs. Now, you might remember him for two reasons. First of all, we had him on November talking about the statistical anomalies about the election. We had a caller last, I think Friday, raised that question. I said, well, let's get David Briggs or William Briggs back on the program to talk about that, because he was with us back in November, pointing out some of these voting irregularities. Does that prove fraud? No. Does it raise very good questions? Yes, it does. So, first of all, he can really address some of the issues that he's looked at since that time, because there were these voting dumps and all sorts of other things that seemed troubling and certainly raised questions statistically. So we want to talk with him about that. You might also remember, if you remember the name, that Dr. William Briggs, along with Dr. Jay Richards and Doug Axe, all wrote a book called The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe, in which they make, I think, a very powerful case, both from medicine and from statistics and from social issues. So each one of those authors brings another level of expertise to the discussion about how the lockdowns were not only not beneficial, they really went into this thinking, well, maybe there was some benefit to the lockdowns, but the downside was huge. They began to realize the lockdowns really didn't do anything. And if you need any evidence for that, look at some of the states that have had very significant lockdowns that are having runaway spreading of the coronavirus, and others that didn't lock down that aren't having the same problem. There's really no correlation. So anyway, the book was really the first to come out and point out that, of course, there were hardly any benefits to the lockdown. And of course, there were tremendous problems in terms of unemployment, in terms of educational issues, in terms of social and mental issues. So again, we will have him with us tomorrow, and that's William Briggs. And so you want to be listening at this hour as we talk about some of the statistics from the campaign, the election, the challenges, as also some of the issues related to the pandemic. And in light of that, let's go right now to KNEO in Missouri. Kay, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I was listening to the guy talk about the Jericho March, and I put that on and I turned that off. We all are, as Christians, have the Holy Spirit living in us, and we live by what the Bible says And we live in a land that has a constitution, and we follow the constitution. Now, you have 7 states that sent 2 sets of electors to the Capitol because they felt like the legislatures felt like that their elections were not right.
And first of all, I'm not sure that's correct. Matter of fact, tried to document the fact that they didn't send the electors, which was one of the reasons why some of those people said we don't have a set of electors to select. So that's the first issue.
I heard the man from Arizona, and they said they only had one there, and he said he personally carried it there.
Well, it wasn't accepted in the Congress, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, they didn't accept it. I understand that they didn't accept it, but they were sent, is what I'm saying. So they're saying they did send them, and they wanted, but you have rules that they couldn't come back and do anything because they were out. So, now we're looking at the statistics coming in. Now, is not 66,000 underage vote? Did not 66,000 underage people vote in the state of Georgia? That's one of the statistics.
Right.
That's not an anomaly. What kid goes out and decides, oh, I'm going to vote this year? Something is wrong here, and we are supposed to stand against that. And I'm really upset what they're doing to Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley because I called him and I wanted him so that people could just hear this. I just mathematically these numbers are not adding up. In your own head, you start listening to them, and then they're not coming up right. Nor is I was from California, and we got pretty used to, we know in California it's not, the voting system is really bad. We know that. But I don't want to see that kind of stuff go all the way across the United States. All we wanted to do was to hear it. I don't understand why, I don't know who those people were that went in, and I guess a lot of people support Trump that are not Christian. But nonetheless, whatever happened, your responsibility is you are supposed to have people that are there protecting the Capitol. You have 1 million people almost there. You don't put anybody to protect it. Let's put the blame where the blame, but not for the people who are only following the Constitution. We had a constitutional right to, if there was a disagreement, and the first guy, we didn't even get through Arizona. Arizona was and it's so funny. You just started getting to hear what was going on from Arizona and the debate, and what happened? The riot. Yeah. It all sounds so strange to me. It's just. But as a Christian, what I didn't like about what he said, the last guy that said, every Christian is not following everything I'm going to be honest, I would have preferred to have Trump. And I surely would have preferred to have somebody besides Obama, but there was nothing to go out against. But this time there is something that is not right here. And that's something that we as Americans should stand up for, and we are taught to stand up for truth.
Well, let me just again come back to something I said the other day, and that is that you have Jonathan Turley, again, a Democrat, a leftist, a professor at George Washington Law School, who nevertheless says we need to have a full investigation. And my frustration, and I think, Kay's, your frustration as well, is that some of us were hoping that even if nothing else, a presentation that would have been done by Ted Cruz most effectively and others would have been able to illustrate our concerns. And that didn't happen for whatever reason, and I think the obvious reason is the debate. And we've been waiting, as we've said before, for now almost months from some of the people that have said, well, we have evidence. And I'm like, okay, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood, give me the evidence. And some of it is trickled out. Some of it turned out to be maybe exaggerated and not true. I would love to have somebody that maybe would actually have a sense of fairness, go through and say which ones of these arguments are true and which ones are not. Georgia the other day came back with some of their possible explanations for what were perceived as, for example, people who voted out of the state who should not have been doing so, and their argument at the time, and I don't trust it necessarily any more than anybody else's, but their argument was, well, you have the wrong names. There's some other people by the same names. We've identified a few people that did vote illegally. Was it enough to overturn Georgia? I don't know. And what about Arizona, as you point out? What about Pennsylvania? What about Michigan? What about Wisconsin? And I was hoping that there would be some kind of forum by which that could be answered. And I think we're really coming back to an argument that we have made from the beginning. We need an investigation. Tomorrow, I'm going to do my best to give William Briggs a chance to talk about some of the statistical issues. And if those can now be resolved, fine, because he certainly surfaced many of those in November. Want to get his estimate on where those stand now that we know a little bit more about that. What about the case that was made, as you mentioned just a minute ago, in Georgia? The Georgia Elections Commission believes they've answered them, but we don't solve these problems, and we don't have all sorts of people who have deep concerns about this election by simply ignoring the issue or by actually accusing people who are convinced that there might have been fraud by saying they're just buying into a conspiracy or ridiculing them. And we are dealing with a different set of issues that even the other day when we talked with Jim Dennison, I pointed out, yes, there were some people that had some questions on the Democratic side in 2016, but we even had a full investigation about Russia influence, which turned out to be nothing, as we all know. But now you have a very significant number, not just of Republicans, but independents and even some Democrats having a question about fraud in this election. We just can't say, well, let's just turn the page and move on. And so, okay, I appreciate your point. You are making a good one, and it's an all the more reason why even tomorrow we'll spend a little bit of time having Dr. William Briggs, who is the individual that I first identified on the stream as an individual evaluating some of those statistical anomalies and questions. And so we'll see what he's been able to uncover and whether he stands by those concerns he raised back in November. So we'll find out from him. When we come back from the break, though, Chuck Bentley is with us, and we're going to get some financial advice. After all of us have to figure out how to navigate in 2021. So be with him right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about your finances because we've been through a very difficult year and the future doesn't look so great either. And so we're going to be talking with our good friend Chuck Bentley, who of course is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries, the host of My Money Life. We have posted one piece that he has posted, preparing for another pandemic. Let's hope we don't have to, but certainly that is the case. Also, a new book, 7 Gray Swans, Trends that Threaten Our Financial Future. And so we have so much to talk about. Chuck, always wonderful to have you here on Point of View with us.
Thank you, Kerby. Happy New Year to you. And I just wanted to mention from the beginning, I've been listening to your program today before I came on as a guest, and I am so grateful, I think today more than ever, for your ability to conduct civil conversation. It is a breath of fresh air. You're patient. You're kind to people. The Bible says the gentle answer turns aside wrath, and I was just admiring that quality in you, Kerby, and I want to be the first to say how much I appreciate it and how necessary it is in this politically charged environment.
Well, and again, it is a tinderbox, so almost anything that has been said, whether it was by the president, whether it's by the Speaker of the House, whether it's by the media, just sets things off. So I understand that, and that's the nature of what it is. And as we start talking about finances, you and I know only so well that is the case. But one of the things that we did post for people to read, and we always encourage people to go to Crown to find out more, is you actually had somebody saying, well, how can I prepare for the future? Because we've been through quite a lot in 2020. That stress and that tension and that uncertainty didn't end on December 31st. It continues here in 2021, which is one of the reasons why you've identified what you also call these gray swans, some of these threats in the future that we need to pay attention to.
Well, that's right, Kerby. When we look back at 2020, we had, I think the word of the year may be unprecedented. We had unprecedented economic developments, a $2 trillion stimulus, 0% interest rates, and even in May we saw future contracts of oil go to negative numbers, which no one had ever seen those kind of things. But because of that, we saw the market soar, we saw real estate prices soar, we see Bitcoin and gold setting historic highs. So it truly is an unprecedented time, and a time that I think what we're going to see is a repeat of that in 2021. It looks to me like we're going to continue to see stimulus money come into the system. We're going to continue to see low interest rates, probably the market soaring, real estate prices going up. And, of course, Bitcoin looks like it's going into the stratosphere. So we need to be prepared for that. And we're going to continue to have significant economic threats. And I think looming large over all the political strife is the fact that there's a great deal of concern about where our economy is headed. I believe Bitcoin is an indication of fear. People are looking to hedge against the possible devaluation of the U.S. dollar because they don't see the wisdom necessary being exercised over the economic decisions of our country. So that's what I've written about and what I hope that we can help our listeners with today.
And I might just mention, like I said, a $2 trillion stimulus. Well, we're not done spending money because the incoming president, Joe Biden, has made it clear that he wants to spend another $2,000 or more for people. And again, who would have ever thought zero interest rates, negative interest rates on oil and other things? And so that kind of brings us into what you have talked about, that there is a point at which you can keep hoping that water will run uphill, but it won't. There are economic consequences, and one of those I know you've written about, if I can use the technical term, this idea of modern monetary theory. There comes a point where we eventually have to pay the piper, and that's why some people really wonder what the economy is going to look like in 2021 or by the end of 2021, right?
Well, when I wrote the book, I did not, this was before some of these things happened, but I said that I believe both sides of the aisle are practicing modern monetary theory. And that's the unorthodox view that deficits don't matter, that the issuers of currency can spend however much money they want to spend. They can print how much they want to print. They can run up deficits, pay the interest on those deficits with new printed money, and that we can essentially act as if we're the bank playing Monopoly. Now, Senator Rand Paul stood on the Senate floor in December and took words right out of my mouth. He said, look, we conservatives, you're saying that you don't believe in modern monetary theory, but you're actually practicing it. You're voting to send money that we don't have. And the argument, Kerby, is, well, we don't have any choice. That's the problem with modern monetary theory. We see ourselves locked into it with no point of escape. It's like, riding the back of a tiger, holding it by the ears. There's no easy exit off of that, and that's what's happening. And so what I'm trying to help people understand, it's surreal, Kerby. Whoever thought we could walk into a bank wearing a mask and demand money? And we're able to walk into a bank, and it's just as surreal as that. When I get those checks in the mail, which I have, I look at it and I say, I can't believe my name is on this check.
Yes.
It doesn't seem real that we're passing out money so indiscriminately. Obviously, there's a crisis. Obviously, there are people in need, and we want to help them. We want to help people get reemployed. We want to see the economy grow. But we can't solve the problem putting sugar into our gasoline tank. It feels good for a little while, possibly, but just like putting it into your body, ultimately the high wears off and it makes you sicker.
It's just unbelievable. And as we've said before, you are certainly standing on the shoulders of Larry Burkett. And when he wrote the book, Coming Economic Earthquake, we were talking about a $2 trillion national debt. And now we're talking about, I've lost track, 27 trillion, close enough, to those kinds of things. So that is one of those issues. But one of the others you raise, I'm holding up two of our booklets here. We have one that we wrote a while back on capitalism and socialism, and the most recent book on socialism. The one on capitalism kind of answers the question socialists have about why capitalism is, quote, bad. Socialism answers the questions about why people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and others say that socialism is good. And you are also deeply concerned about the fact that there is a move from even kind of traditional liberalism into what we might call democratic socialism. What about that?
Well, it's happening, Kerby. It's not only happening in real time, but it's also being front-end loaded through academia into the next generation, that it's a good thing. The idea is that it's going to bring equality. And if you're against equality, then you're a very bad person. You're greedy. You're one of those people who are insensitive to the needs of others. And it's easy to fall into the emotional trap of thinking that equality is possible through government intervention. And that's the platform that we're seeing catch on. And it's a departure from economic principles. It's not just a political philosophy. It's more of an economic philosophy of how is wealth created, how is wealth distributed, and how is wealth used. And my contention is that Jesus did not support democratic socialism. There is no premise in the Scripture that would hold that philosophy up to scrutiny, and it would not pass scrutiny. And so I think as believers, we have to be careful what philosophies we're falling for and falling into. And we need to be prepared to push back against this idea that centralized control of wealth is going to be a good thing. As I think it was Churchill who said he does believe that socialism brings about equality of misery, not of prosperity.
For sure. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues because you've written about the idea of social scoring. And you may have noticed, but there does seem to be some big tech censorship right now and use of some of the kinds of things that you found only in China happening here in the United States. So first of all, let me encourage you to find out all you can about some of the great material which is available through Crown Financial. You can simply go to crown.org, and there are some ways in which you can not only get a copy of this book, it's an ebook, so it's really easy to get. You simply go to crown.org and you can click on that button and get that and read it in Kindle. Of course, you can find out more about some of these very important issues, and most importantly, we've taken the time to post one of the answers that came from Chuck on how to address this issue of the pandemic. This particular person said, I wasn't ready for the pandemic. My health has been fine, but my finances have not. So what does he recommend? Let us hope we don't have to go through any more of this, but I got a feeling that it'll be a while before we come out on the other side. And if you've actually paid attention to some of the things I've been mentioning today, my commentary is even talking about the possibility of what some are calling a death spiral of public life. So the new normal is not going to be like it was this time last year. We'll come back, though. I want to pick out a few more very important issues in his ebook, which is called 7 Gray Swans. We'll talk more about that. And by the way, if you have a question, 1-800-351-1212. Chuck Bentley with us. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes with Chuck Bentley as we talk about his book that has come out on 7 Gray Swans. Contrary to a black swan, these are events that can be observed right now, and there's steps you can take to address that issue. And like I said, some of the booklets we've been making available to our donors on capitalism and socialism. Let's get to another one, because one of the booklets I've made available is called Privacy and Surveillance, and those of you that support this ministry receive those in the mail, and others, if you'd like to get them, are available. And one of those things, Chuck, is I knew that some of the censorship from big tech was coming. I didn't know it had all come within about 24 hours of each other, but it gets back to one of the things in your Seven Gray Swans book, and that is social scoring, which has been used in China because it's saying, well, if you're in this particular group and you do these things as a communist, you will thrive. But if you don't, then it's sort of almost like the cancel culture. And then, of course, even talking about this idea of biometric identification, we're living in a high-tech society, but it isn't necessarily good news if they're on the wrong side of some of the people that are the digital overlords, is it?
Well, we've seen what's happened in China where the government is taking control of technology, and they're essentially using it to control their people. A social score in China can lock you out of travel, out of government buildings. It can lock you out of receiving your tax refund or even receiving funds from the government if you're on government assistance. And they score you for bad driving. If you bad drive, your score goes down. If you eat too much junk food, you get a lower score. If you have friends online who have lower social scores than you, and you seem to be talking to the wrong crowd, they will lower your score. If you post anything that criticizes the government, they'll lower your score. And we say, oh, that's awful. We hope it doesn't come to here. Well, look, it's already here, but it's in the private sector right now. You can get excluded from renting any house on Airbnb just for any reason whatsoever. An Uber driver rates you, and if they give you a consistently low score, you will never be able to use Uber. And, of course, we're seeing what the social media companies today choose to cancel free speech for private individuals, even public elected officials. And it's only a matter of time before that very same thing that's happening in China is going to start happening in the United States, not only in the private sector, but also when the government begins to intervene and they start saying what is appropriate and inappropriate. So I think this gray swan has arrived. But, when I wrote the book, Kerby, it wasn't here. And suddenly, a week after the book is released, it is front and center on our minds, and we're realizing what can happen to lose our freedom of speech.
A lot of this can concern people, but when you talk about financial advice, I know your advice is always the same. Give more, save more, invest wisely. And it does seem to me that if an individual finds themselves in debt, yes, we have a booklet on debt as well, and consumer debt and credit card debt and student loan debt, which was my commentary yesterday, and all these are concerns. But still, basic biblical principles, basic financial common sense are what we need to have in the 21st century. True?
Kerby, if there was ever a time that we need to give more to the things that support the truth in this country, it's now. It's so painfully obvious what the Bible said, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And our treasures need to be going into the type of activities that support truth, because we're in a time when truth is under attack. The truth is being called a lie, and the lie is being called the truth. And that's because people are not believing God's way. And when we reject God's way, it turns the world upside down. And so we've got to put our money where our mouth is and support those things that proclaim truth, that advance truth, that do it in a winsome way, but do it in a fully equipped way, that really fight for the ideas and the philosophies that align with God's word. And so we've got to give more and to give to the places that are strategic to advance the cause of Christ. We also have to save more. We're in a shaky time. It's going to be really difficult for the government to back off of this modern monetary theory. As I said, they're riding the back of a tiger. You don't know how to get off of that easily. And so as believers, we need to be prepared. We need to increase our financial margin, and we also need to invest wisely. You're seeing the rise of some major bubbles. I just read today, Kerby, that Tesla stock, the company would have to produce profits for 1,600 years in a row to meet the valuation of how overpriced it is right now.
Yeah.
And so we need to be wise. We don't need to be caught up in the fads and in sort of this emotional reaction to our circumstance, but depend on the timeless Word of God to guide all of our decisions. God said to put giving first. He said we're wise if we save for the future and we're prepared for what may come. And we ultimately make investments that are diversified, and we don't follow the crowd with a get-rich-quick mentality. We don't jump on something just for fear of missing out, but we make wise choices so that we're the people who are calm during the crisis, and we demonstrate our house is built on the rock. And look, Kerby, I think when we do those things, we're ready for the storms.
Yes.
And we can be most effective for the Lord when others are just in absolute panic. And I know your phones have been ringing off the wall with people who are panicked. And our role is to help them be prepared, to be calm, and to be in a position to make a difference. When that water starts rising, you don't want to be trying to build your life raft. You need the life raft now.
Well said. And again, we had a little bit of a problem with our phones. We'll take more of those calls tomorrow. I've even seen some people coming in there as well. But let's, if we can, maybe if I can, I think we're ready with one of the phone calls. Take that. But while we're doing that, let me also mention that we have a link to crown.org. You can also then get that ebook on 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. And in some respects, some of those were gray swans. Now they're black swans. So that is indeed the case. So we'll see if we can get a few people on the line. Martha, what would you like to ask real quickly?
So I've always been good about giving. I'm happy. God gives me peace with that. But the investing part that you guys were talking about, how does someone go about that if they have never done it? And I don't want to invest in the wrong thing. There's so many things where, say, China is linked in the background, and I don't even know where to begin. Giving, I can do. Saving,
Sure.
I can do. Investing, I don't know.
That's a good question. And again, I would point people to crown.org. We've got about a minute. Any comments real quickly, Chuck?
Yeah, I'll give you 3 quick tips on that, Martha. Biblical principles. Number 1, invest in what you know and understand. It takes wisdom to be a good investor, and so don't just pick something that someone advises you to go with. Number 2, learn all you can about whatever you're going to invest in. Read, study, research, really get informed about it. And then number 3, always be diversified. Solomon said that we don't know what the future holds, and the best strategy when it comes to investing is to not put your eggs in one basket. Solomon didn't say that, but he said it in certain terms in Ecclesiastes 11:2, that we're to put our investments in 7 to 8 different places so that we're not dependent on one thing. And that's the best way to protect yourself as you venture into investing. But it's a good time to do so because the market will continue to rise because of all this stimulus money.
Very good.
For the short term, anyway.
Yeah, and again, crown.org, you can find out more about finding a budget coach or a Christian credit counselor, all the rest. Of course, you can follow Chuck's blog. And Chuck, I appreciate you being with us and always look forward to the next opportunity.
Carry on, Kerby. You're doing a great job, and we appreciate you so much.
Please encourage you to support Crown Financial. We think so highly of them, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring them on today as we look to the future. But we are out of time today. Tomorrow we'll get back into some of those issues. We've got a couple of guests that will be with us, but mostly I'm going to leave an open line because I know some of you have some comments or questions, and it's still a time of uncertainty. So we'll do our best to try to answer your questions and hopefully be your trusted source for news and information. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.